6:15 in the morning on June 4, 1942, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Counts climbed into the cockpit of his Brewster F-2 Buffalo at Midway Atoll, fully aware that he was about to fly an aircraft that would likely get him killed. The Buffalo was outdated. Everyone knew it. The Marines who flew it called it the flying coffin. The plane was overweight, underpowered, and completely outmatched by the Japanese fighters it would face in roughly 40 minutes. Counts was 22 years old. He had been stationed at Midway for 3 weeks. This would be his first combat mission. Radar had just detected a massive Japanese air raid heading toward the island, 93 miles out and closing fast. 36 Zeros escorted the bombers. The Zero was faster, more agile, could turn tighter, and outclimb the Buffalo in every measurable way. American doctrine instructed pilots never to dogfight a Zero, exploit your aircraft's strengths, strike quickly, and avoid prolonged turning engagements. The problem was the Buffalo had no strengths. It was slower than the Zero at altitude, less maneuverable in turns, and its only minor advantage, slightly heavier armor, only made it slower and more sluggish. At Midway, the Marines had 21 Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The Wildcats were marginally better but not by much. Most pilots were assigned to the Buffalo, including Counts. 26 fighters took off that morning. 14 pilots would not return. The Buffalo was never meant to be so inadequate. When it first flew in December 1937, it marked a significant advancement for the U.S. Navy, being the first monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear, replacing obsolete biplanes. By 1938, the prototype exceeded 300 miles per hour and demonstrated decent handling, prompting the Navy to order 54 aircraft, with production beginning in 1939. Problems arose as the production version, designated F-2A1, gained weight during development. The Navy requested more fuel capacity, more ammunition, heavier guns, armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Each addition seemed reasonable individually, but collectively, they crippled performance. The F-2A2 added more weight with additional equipment. By the time the F-2A3 entered service in 1941, the aircraft carried 1,300 pounds more than the original prototype, while the engine, a WRA or 1820 Cyclone producing 1,200 horsepower, remained unchanged. The engine could barely handle the original design. With the added weight, the Buffalo became dangerously underpowered. Maximum speed dropped to 310 miles per hour, and climb rate fell to 2,000 feet per minute. The aircraft felt sluggish and unresponsive. Pilots reported heavy controls and that the Buffalo wallowed through maneuvers as though moving through water. Wing loading increased sharply. The small wings could not support the heavier frame efficiently, creating high stall speeds and poor low-speed handling, exactly the characteristics a fighter needed to avoid in dogfights. The landing gear was weak. Hard landings frequently bent struts and collapsed wheels. Maintenance crews spent hours repairing gear that should have been stronger from the start. Worse, everyone knew about these problems months before Midway. The first combat deployment of the F-2A Buffalo came in early 1942 in Southeast Asia. Royal Air Force squadrons in Malaya and Singapore flew Buffaloes against Japanese fighters during the invasion. The results were disastrous. Japanese Zeros and Ki-43 Oscars decimated the Buffaloes. British pilots reported that the Buffalo could not match Japanese fighters in speed, climb, or maneuverability. Dogfighting meant death. Trying to dive away led to pursuit and destruction. Dutch pilots in the Netherlands East Indies faced the same nightmare, flying slightly lighter B-339 export Buffaloes. Even reduced weight did not help. They lost most of their aircraft within 3 months. Several Dutch pilots described the Buffalo as a death trap. Despite warnings from the Pacific Theater, the U.S. Marine Corps continued using Buffaloes at Midway. The reason was simple: no better aircraft were available. Superior fighters were assigned to aircraft carriers or Hawaii squadrons. Midway received the leftovers. Marine Fighting Squadron 221, led by Major Floyd Parks, received a mixed group of 21 Buffaloes and 7 Wildcats in late 1941. The squadron trained for months, learning the Buffalo's limitations, its poor climb rate, sluggish roll, and tendency to wallow in turns. Tactics were developed to compensate, but tactics only work if the aircraft can execute them. The Buffalo could not. Major Floyd Parks knew his squadron flew obsolete fighters. At 34, he was an experienced pilot who had flown since 1931. He had read reports from Asia and knew what happened to Buffalo pilots who faced Zeros. On the morning of June 4, Parks briefed his pilots before the scramble, emphasizing altitude advantage, formation discipline, and avoiding prolonged engagements. The instructions were sound but could not compensate for the aircraft's fundamental inadequacy. When radar detected the Japanese raid at 5:55 a.m., Parks ordered an immediate launch. Within minutes, 26 fighters climbed toward 30,000 feet, racing to gain altitude before the Japanese arrived. Parks organized his aircraft into 5 divisions, 4 flying Buffaloes, 1 flying Wildcats. Roughly 6:40 a.m., Parks spotted the Japanese formation 30 miles northwest of Midway, over 100 aircraft, bombers escorted by 36 Zeros, flying tightly at 14,000 feet. Parks had the altitude advantage at 15,000 feet, positioned between the Japanese and Midway. He ordered the attack. The 1st Division, led by Parks himself, dove toward the bombers, 5 Buffaloes against more than 100 enemy planes. They got one pass before the Zeros reacted. Parks fired at a bomber, saw tracers hit the fuselage, then had to break off as 3 Zeros dove on his tail. He tried to dive away, the Zeros followed effortlessly, closing fast. Parks pulled into a hard turn to force an overshoot, but the Buffalo wallowed slowly. The Zeros stayed with him, firing continuously. Parks's Buffalo took multiple hits. 20mm cannon shells tore through the right wing and fuselage. The engine smoked. Parks attempted a crash landing on Midway, but the aircraft broke apart at 5,000 feet, wing structure failing from combat damage and maneuvering stress. He died instantly. His entire division was wiped out within 7 minutes. 2nd Lieutenant Charles Counds flew in the 3rd Division, for Buffaloes tasked with engaging the fighter escort. Counds watched Parks's division get annihilated, Buffaloes burning and plummeting toward the ocean. Then the Zeros turned on his division. He had roughly 15 seconds to decide. Doctrine instructed maintaining speed, using altitude, and avoiding turning fights, but the Zeros were already matching his altitude and turning toward him, and his Buffalo could not outrun them in level flight. He had no good options. He rolled into a defensive turn, hoping to force the Zeros to overshoot. The Buffalo's controls felt frozen. He pulled back on the stick, the nose climbed slowly, too slowly. A Zero snapped inside his turn, got on his tail, and opened fire. Counts saw tracer rounds streaming past his canopy, felt impacts along the fuselage, and heard the sharp cracks of cannon shells striking metal. He tried to roll out and dive, but the Buffalo was not responding fast enough. More hits. The instrument panel exploded. The engine seized. The aircraft began vibrating violently. Cohen knew he was going down. He managed to keep the Buffalo level long enough to gain some airspeed, then ditched in the ocean 3 miles from Midway. He survived. His aircraft sank within 2 minutes. Of the 26 Marine fighters that took off that morning, 17 were shot down. 14 of those were Buffaloes. Marine Fighting Squadron 221 effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. The Japanese lost 5 fighters. The kill ratio was catastrophic. For every Marine fighter that shot down a Zero, more than 3 Marine aircraft were destroyed. The Buffaloes accounted for most of the losses. Pilots who survived described the same experience. The aircraft was too slow to escape, too unresponsive to dogfight, too poorly armed to achieve kills quickly. Several pilots managed to damage Japanese aircraft, but could not finish them off because the Buffalo could not keep up during pursuit. The few Marine pilots who scored kills did so at close range, often sustaining damage in the process. Captain Marion Carl, flying a Wildcat, shot down 2 Japanese aircraft, but described the engagement as desperate and chaotic. He stated that the Wildcats were barely adequate, and the Buffaloes were significantly worse. After the battle, the surviving Marines at Midway refused to fly Buffaloes in combat again. The squadron was re-equipped with Wildcats within weeks. Every remaining Buffalo at Midway was grounded, stripped for parts, or used as ground targets for gunnery practice. The aircraft's operational career in the United States military effectively ended at Midway. It had lasted less than 6 months. But the Buffalo was not the only pathetically inadequate fighter aircraft that flew during World War II. Other nations produced fighters that were equally disastrous aircraft that killed their own pilots faster than they killed the enemy. Germany, despite producing some of the war's most effective fighters, also created one of its worst. The Messerschmitt Me 210 was supposed to replace the Bluff 110 heavy fighter, but instead, it nearly destroyed Messed's reputation and forced the Luftwaffe to continue using outdated aircraft for years. The Me 210's development began in 1937 before the Bf 110 had even entered full production. Messerschmitt engineers wanted to create a superior multi-role aircraft capable of serving as a heavy fighter, reconnaissance plane, and fast bomber. On paper, the design looked promising. The Me 210 featured 2 Daimler-Benz DB601 engines producing 1150 horsepower each. It had a more streamlined fuselage than the Bf 110, better visibility for the crew, and defensive armament in remote-controlled gun turrets. The Reich Air Ministry was so impressed that they ordered 1,000 aircraft in mid-1940. Before the prototype had even flown. This decision would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. The first prototype M210V1 made its maiden flight on September 2. The test pilot immediately noticed severe handling problems. The aircraft suffered from extreme longitudinal and directional instability. It oscillated constantly during flight, snaking left and right without pilot input. In turns, the instability became dangerous. The aircraft would snap into unexpected attitudes, making precise maneuvering impossible. Engineers tried multiple fixes. They replaced the twin-tail design with a single large vertical stabilizer. This had almost no effect. The aircraft continued to oscillate. They added automatic leading-edge slats to improve stall characteristics. This made things worse. With the nose up or in a turn, the slats would open and the Mi-210 would whip into violent spins. The second prototype, Mi-210V2, crashed during flutter testing in September 1940. The pilot barely managed to bail out before the aircraft broke apart. He described the spin as unrecoverable once it started. The chief test pilot for Message stated that the M210 had all the least desirable attributes an airplane could possess. Despite these catastrophic problems, production continued. The Reich Air Ministry was desperate to replace the Bf-110, which had proven vulnerable to British fighters during the Battle of Britain. They pressured Mess to fix the Mi-210 quickly and get it into service. 16 prototypes and 94 pre-production aircraft were built in an attempt to resolve the design flaws. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem was the aircraft's aerodynamics. The wing design created inadequate directional stability. The fuselage was too short relative to the tail surfaces. The center of gravity was poorly positioned. These were not minor issues that could be fixed with adjustments. They required a complete redesign. Messerschmitt knew this. The Reich Air Ministry refused to accept it. Full production began in early 1941. Deliveries to frontline units started in April 1942. Pilots hated the aircraft immediately. Leutnant Vera Streib, a night fighter pilot with significant combat experience, flew the Mi-210-4 evaluation and reported that it was unsuitable for combat operations. The instability made it impossible to use as a steady gun platform. In dogfights, the aircraft's unpredictable handling endangered the pilot more than it endangered the enemy. Landing was particularly hazardous. The M210 had weak landing gear that frequently collapsed on touchdown. Combined with the aircraft's unstable flight characteristics, landing accidents were common. Several pilots were killed or seriously injured during routine landings, not in combat. By April 1942, after approximately 90 Mi-210s had been delivered, the Luftwaffe made an extraordinary decision. They can-led production. They ordered all Mi-210 deliveries stopped immediately. They restarted production of the Bf-110. An aircraft they had planned to retire because it was better than the Mi-210 despite being several years older. 120 partially completed Mi-210s were placed in storage. The Luftwaffe refused to accept them. Messerschmitt attempted to salvage the program by developing an improved version, the Mi-410, with a lengthened fuselage and more powerful engines. The Mi-410 addressed some of the Mi-210's problems and eventually saw limited service, but it never fully overcame the reputation damage caused by the Mi-210 disaster. The M210 represented a complete failure of the German aircraft development process. An aircraft was ordered in massive quantities before testing was complete. Obvious design flaws were ignored in favor of maintaining production schedules. Pilots were forced to fly an aircraft that was more likely to kill them through mechanical failure than enemy action. The entire program wasted resources, delayed development of better aircraft, and damaged pilot confidence in Mess's designs. Italy produced an even more spectacular failure. The Bradbar 88 Lince was an aircraft so pathetically inadequate that it could barely take off with a combat load, and when it did manage to get airborne, it could not maintain altitude or keep formation with other aircraft. The Bar 88 began development in 1936 as a multi-role aircraft capable of serving as a heavy fighter, reconnaissance plane, and ground attack aircraft.
The design looked impressively modern.
It featured a sleek all-metal fuselage, retractable landing gear, and twin pop-1
radial engines producing 1,000 horsepower each. The prototype first flew in October 1936 and immediately impressed observers.
It was fast, reaching speeds over 300 miles per hour.
In April
1937, Italian test pilot Furio Nicolo set two world speed over distance records in the Bar 88 prototype, averaging 321 miles per hour, over 100 kilometers, and 295 mph, over 1,000 km. Fascist propaganda celebrated the aircraft as proof of
Italian engineering superiority. The Italian Air Ministry ordered the Bar 88 into production, then reality destroyed the illusion.
The production aircraft were heavier than the prototype by over 2,000 pounds. Military equipment, armor, weapons, ammunition, radios, and operational systems added weight that the prototype never carried.
The engines remained the same, performance collapsed. The production Bar 88 could barely reach 200 miles per hour. Climb rate was abysmal. The aircraft struggled to reach 10,000 feet with a full combat load.
Wing loading increased dramatically, making the aircraft
unstable and difficult to control.
The most significant problem was that the
Bar 88 was fundamentally over-engineered. The designers used both a traditional steel tube internal structure and a stress skin outer covering, essentially building two airframes and combining them.
This provided enormous structural strength but added massive unnecessary
weight. The aircraft could withstand stresses far beyond what combat operations required, but it was too heavy to fly effectively. Italian Air Force test pilots reported these problems during evaluation trials in
1939. They recommended canceling production.
The Italian government ignored the recommendation. Political considerations outweighed operational reality. Canceling the Bar 88 would mean
closing production lines and admitting that fascist propaganda had exaggerated Italian technological capabilities.
Production continued.
81 aircraft were built by Bratta and 24 by IMA.
When Italy entered World War II in June 1940, several squadrons were equipped with Bar 88s. The 7th Gruppo Autonomo was assigned to the type for operations in North Africa. The aircraft's operational debut came on June 16, 1940 during Italian attacks on French airfields in Corsica. 12 Bar 88s participated in the raid.
The lack of French opposition allowed the Italian aircraft to complete their missions without losses, but crews reported that the Bar 88s were extremely underpowered and handled poorly. These problems were about to get much worse. In August 1940, the 7th Gruppo moved to Libya to fight British forces
operating
in North African desert conditions required modifications to the aircraft.
Sand filters were installed on the engines to prevent dust ingestion. These filters restricted airflow, reducing engine power output by approximately 30%. The already underpowered Bar 88 became almost unflyable. On September 14, 1940, the 7th Grouper was
ordered to attack the British airfield at Sidi Alani, approximately 250 kilometers behind the front lines. 3 Bar 88s were assigned to the mission. Each aircraft carried 250 kilograms of bombs, full ammunition loads, and full fuel tanks.
The attack never happened. The first Bar 88 attempted to take off and could not gain enough speed. The pilot aborted the takeoff before reaching the end of the runway. The second Bar 88 managed to get
airborne but immediately began losing altitude.
The pilot could not maintain level flight. He circled back to the airfield and landed, aborting the mission.
The third Bar 88, piloted by the unit commander, took off successfully but could not climb above 500 m. He flew toward the target but continued losing altitude slowly.
Realizing he would
never reach El Barani, he jettisoned his bombs over empty desert and returned to base, flying barely above ground level. The mission was a complete failure.
None
of the 3 aircraft reached the target.
None dropped bombs on the enemy. One could not even take off. Italian commanders were horrified. An NDA to the 22 aircraft that could not complete basic missions was worse than useless. It consumed fuel, required maintenance, tied up pilots and ground crews, and provided zero combat capability. Desperate attempts were made to improve performance. The rear gunner and rear gun were removed to save weight. Internal equipment was stripped out. Bomb loads were reduced to 100 kilograms. Fuel was reduced to half tanks.
None of these measures made significant difference.
The BAR-88 remained fundamentally incapable of performing its mission. By mid-November 1940, only 5 months after Italy entered the war, the remaining BAR-88s in North Africa were grounded. They were stripped of all useful equipment. Weapons were removed.
Radios were salvaged and the empty airframes were
scattered around Italian airfields as decoys. British reconnaissance aircraft would photograph these decoys and report
them as operational Italian fighters, wasting British intelligence resources
trying to track aircraft that could not fly. This was the most useful role the BAR-88 ever performed, serving as a stationary target to confuse the enemy. The degradation was complete.
An aircraft that had set world speed records in 1937 was now being used as an
immobile decoy in 1940. The Rea Aeronautica was forced to continue using
completely obsolete aircraft like the Brada 65 and Fiat CR32 biplanes because the modern BAR-88 was worse than aircraft designed 10 years earlier.
Additional BAR-88s continued to be delivered throughout 1940 and 1941. Most went directly from the factory to scrap yards.
Usable components were salvaged and the airframes were
destroyed.
Approximately 150 BAR-88s were built.
Almost none saw combat after September 1940.
The aircraft represented perhaps the most complete failure of any World War
II combat aircraft. It looked modern, set impressive records as a lightweight prototype, and was completely useless once military equipment was installed. These 3 aircraft, the Brewster Buffalo, Messerschmitt Me 210, and
Breda BAR-88,
shared common characteristics that made them pathetically inadequate. All 3 looked promising during initial development. All 3 suffered from weight increases that destroyed performance. All 3 entered service despite warnings from test pilots. All
3 killed or endangered their own pilots more effectively than they harmed the enemy.
The human cost of flying inadequate aircraft was enormous.
At Midway, 14 Buffalo pilots died in a
single morning because their aircraft could not compete with Japanese fighters. Major Floyd Parks, an experienced squadron commander, was killed because his Buffalo could not execute the maneuvers needed to survive combat. Second Lieutenant Charles Cohen survived only because he ditched close
enough to Midway that rescue boats could reach him before he drowned.
German pilots flying the Me 210 faced similar dangers.
The aircraft's instability killed pilots during routine
training flights. Oberleutnant Hans Joachim Jabs, a successful night fighter pilot, refused to fly the Mi-210 operationally after evaluating it, stating that he would rather fly an obsolete Bf-110 than risk his life in an aircraft that could kill him without enemy intervention. Italian pilots in North Africa watched their BAR-88s fail to take off and realized they were flying death traps. Several Italian pilots requested transfers to units flying older but functional aircraft. They preferred to fly obsolete biplanes that could at least get airborne and maneuver. The psychological impact on pilots was devastating. Combat pilots accepted risk. They understood that flying against the enemy meant facing death. What they could not accept was dying because their own aircraft was inadequate. Pilots flying Buffaloes at Midway knew before takeoff that their aircraft was inferior to what they would face. They flew anyway because orders demanded it, but the knowledge that they were outmatched from the start eroded morale and confidence. Survivors of the Midway battle described feeling helpless during the engagement. They did everything their training taught them, followed proper tactics, made correct decisions, and still got shot down because their aircraft simply could not perform. Captain Marion Carl, one of the few Marines who survived and scored kills at Midway, stated in later interviews that the Buffalo pilots were
not killed because of pilot error or poor tactics. They were killed because they were sent into combat with inferior
equipment. The responsibility for those deaths lay with the decision-makers who continued fielding inadequate aircraft, despite clear evidence of their deficiencies.
Similar frustrations affected German
pilots flying the Mi-210. They were promised an advanced fighter that would dominate the battlefield.
Instead, they received an unstable aircraft that fought them as much as it fought the enemy. The reputation damage to Messid was significant. Pilots who had trusted Messid designs after flying the excellent Bf-109 became skeptical of
new Messerschmitt aircraft.
When the Mi-410 was introduced, many pilots refused to fly it initially, assuming it would have the same problems as the Mi-210. Restoring confidence required months of
demonstration flights and successful combat operations. Italian pilots faced the worst situation. The Bar 88 failure exposed deeper problems in Italian military procurement and industrial capability. Pilots began questioning whether any Italian-designed aircraft could be trusted.
This skepticism undermined confidence across the entire Regia
Aeronautica and contributed to poor morale throughout the Italian Air Force.
The institutional failures that produced these pathetic aircraft revealed systemic problems in how military
aviation developed during the war. In every case, political and bureaucratic pressures overrode technical reality. The United States Navy knew the Buffalo was obsolete by early 1942, but continued deploying it because better alternatives were not available in sufficient numbers, and scrapping the Buffalo would mean admitting the procurement process had failed. German officials ordered 1,000 miles 210s before the prototype flew because they were desperate for a Bf-110 replacement and assumed engineering problems could be fixed during production. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Italian fascist leadership demanded that the Bar 88 enter production despite test pilot warnings because canceling the program would be politically embarrassing. These decisions were made by people far from the combat zones, officials who would never fly the inadequate aircraft they approved. The consequences of their decisions fell on young pilots, men in their early 20s who climbed into cockpits knowing their aircraft was inferior and might kill them. Second Lieutenant Charles Cohen was 22 when he flew his Buffalo at Midway.
He had been flying for less than a year.
Major Floyd Parks was 34, experienced and skilled. Both flew the same inadequate aircraft. Experience could not compensate for an aircraft that was fundamentally outmatched. Parks died and Cohen barely
survived, not because of differing skill levels, but because luck determined which pilot the Zeros targeted first. The engineering lessons from these failures were learned slowly and at terrible cost.
The Buffalo demonstrated that adding weight to an airframe without increasing engine power destroys performance. The Navy's procurement process allowed incremental additions of equipment without comprehensive analysis of cumulative effects. Armor protection,
self-sealing fuel tanks, heavier guns, and radio equipment were each justified.
Individually, collectively, they destroyed the aircraft's performance. Post-war analysis identified multiple decision points where production should have been halted. At each point, bureaucratic momentum and reluctance to admit failure kept production moving forward. The Mi-210 showed that aerodynamic stability cannot be fixed with minor adjustments once the basic design is flawed. After the second prototype crashed in
September 1940, engineers submitted reports stating the aircraft required
fundamental redesign. They proposed lengthening the fuselage and completely redesigning tail surfaces. Reich Air Ministry officials rejected these proposals because implementing them would delay production. Instead,
officials ordered Messid to find solutions that did not require major structural changes.
16 prototypes and 94 pre-production aircraft were built in a desperate attempt to fix unfixable problems. The Luftwaffe eventually paid for this institutional failure with pilot lives and wasted resources. The Bar 88 revealed that building an aircraft that is structurally overdesigned creates an aircraft that is too heavy to fly effectively. Italian
engineers built an airframe strong enough to withstand forces far beyond combat requirements.
The Bar 88 could have survived a dive at terminal velocity and pulled out without structural failure. This capability was
Useless because the aircraft could not reach altitude in the first place and could barely accelerate to high speeds. The over-engineering stemmed from conservative design philosophy and lack of understanding about stressed skin construction. Italian engineers in the 1930s were transitioning from fabric-covered steel tube airframes to all-metal stressed skin construction. They did not fully trust the new methods, so they included both traditional internal structure and modern stressed skin covering. This belt and suspenders approach created an airframe with double the necessary strength and double the necessary weight. Test pilots reported these problems immediately. The production bar 88 was clearly overweight. Engineers calculated that removing the redundant internal structure would save approximately 1,000 kilograms. They proposed doing exactly that before full production began. Italian Air Ministry officials rejected the proposal. Redesigning the structure would require new engineering analysis, new testing, and production delays. Officials decided it was better to produce a heavy aircraft immediately than to delay production while making improvements. This decision guaranteed the Bar 88 would fail operationally. After the war, aviation historians and engineers studied these failures to understand how such disasters occurred. The consensus was that inadequate testing, political pressure, and bureaucratic momentum allowed flawed aircraft to enter production. In peacetime, these aircraft would have been cancelled after initial test flights revealed their problems. During war, the pressure to produce large quantities of aircraft quickly meant that quality control and thorough testing were sometimes sacrificed. The Buffalo Mi-210 and Bar 88 were extreme examples of this phenomenon, but they were not unique. Many other aircraft during World War II suffered from similar, though less severe problems. The enemy perspective on these aircraft revealed how dramatically inadequate they were. Japanese pilots who encountered Buffaloes at Midway reported that the American fighters posed minimal threat. Lieutenant Yoshio, a Zero pilot who participated in the Midway raid, stated in post-war interviews that shooting down Buffaloes was easier than training exercises against Japanese aircraft. The Buffaloes were slower, less maneuverable, and could not escape once a Zero got on their tail. Shea described engaging a Buffalo that tried to dive away. He followed easily, close to less than 100 m, and fired a short burst. The Buffalo exploded. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 seconds. Japanese pilots at Midway claimed 14 American fighters shot down. They lost 5 Zeros. The disparity was stark. The Japanese considered the engagement a successful fighter sweep with minimal opposition. They were more concerned about American anti-aircraft fire from Midway Island than about the defending fighters. This was the ultimate humiliation for the Buffalo pilots. They were not just outmatched. They were considered negligible threats by enemy pilots who fought them. Japanese after action. Reports from Midway mentioned the American fighters only briefly, noting that they were inferior aircraft poorly suited for combat against Zeros. The report spent more time discussing American bomber attacks than the fighter opposition. To the Japanese, the Buffaloes at Midway were barely worth mentioning. German pilots had similar assessments of the Mi-210. Pilots who transitioned from the Bf-110 to the Mi-210 requested transfers back to their old aircraft. Major Walter Ayer Zera, a pilot with combat experience on both the Eastern and Western fronts, flew the Mi-210 during evaluation trials. In 1942, he submitted a detailed report stating that the Mi-210 was unsuitable for any combat role. Its instability made accurate gunnery impossible. Its unpredictable stall characteristics made defensive maneuvering suicidal. Its weak landing gear made every landing hazardous regardless of combat damage. Ayer concluded his report by stating that he would rather fly a captured British aircraft than fly the Mi-210 into combat. This was an extraordinary statement from a German officer, effectively saying that enemy aircraft were superior to a new German design. Ayer's report was not unique. Multiple German pilots submitted similar assessments. The collective pilot opinion was so negative that Luftwaffe leadership could not ignore
When production was cancelled in April 1942, pilots cheered. Several squadron
commanders threw parties celebrating the cancellation.
An unprecedented reaction to the termination of a new aircraft program. British pilots who encountered the Bar 88 had the opposite experience from Midway. They never saw the Italian
aircraft in combat because the Bar 88s never made it to the combat zone.
Royal
Air Force intelligence officers in North Africa initially tracked Bar 88 movements carefully, assuming the
modern-looking Italian aircraft posed a significant threat. When reconnaissance flights photographed Bar 8s scattered
around Italian airfields, British planners allocated resources to bombing those airfields.
They did not realize until months later that the Bar 88s were empty decoys. British intelligence wasted time and
effort tracking aircraft that had been grounded permanently when captured.
Italian documents revealed the Bar 88's true capabilities after the Italian surrender in 1943. British analysts were astonished. An aircraft that looked modern and had set world speed records was unable to perform basic combat missions. The Bar 88 became a case study in British intelligence training, an example of why visual assessment of enemy equipment could be misleading. An aircraft could look threatening and be completely ineffective.
The pilots who flew these pathetic aircraft and survived carried the experience with
them for decades.
Charles Counds, the Buffalo pilot who ditched at Midway, returned to the United States in 1943 after recovering from injuries sustained in his ditching.
He flew training
missions for the remainder of the war, but never returned to combat. He left the Marine Corps in 1946 and worked as a
commercial airline pilot for 32 years. In interviews decades later, he
described flying the Buffalo at Midway as the most terrifying experience of his life, not because of the Japanese, but because he knew his aircraft could not protect him. He explained that contemporary fighter pilots operating aircraft such as the F-14 Tomcat or F-15 Eagle could never truly grasp what it was like to pilot an airplane that was inferior to the enemy in every measurable aspect. The sense of helplessness lingered for him each time he flew a commercial airliner, comfortable and secure. He recalled that morning at Midway when his Buffalo disintegrated under Japanese gunfire, forcing him to ditch in the ocean, convinced he would perish. He survived because rescue boats reached him within 30 minutes. Dozens of other Buffalo pilots at Midway were less fortunate, perishing in aircraft that should never have entered combat. Marion Carl, who piloted a Wildcat at Midway and survived, went on to become a test pilot after the war, flying experimental planes including early jets and rocket-powered aircraft. He eventually attained the rank of Major General in the Marine Corps before retiring in 1973. Carl observed that even the most hazardous experimental planes he flew felt safer than his combat sorties at Midway, because experimental aircraft carried unknown risks while the Buffalo had known shortcomings that could not be overcome. He became a strong advocate for better pilot equipment and reform in aircraft procurement, testifying before Congress repeatedly about the necessity of fielding competitive aircraft. His statements often referenced Midway and the Buffalo, emphasizing that inadequate equipment claimed the lives of American pilots regardless of their skill or bravery. Carl's advocacy helped drive reforms in naval aviation procurement during the 1950s and 1960s. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 82. German pilots who operated the Me-210 were reluctant to discuss it in post-war interviews. The topic was embarrassing, a reminder of systemic failure. Oberleutnant Vera Streib, who had assessed the Me-210 and deemed it unfit for combat, later became one of Germany's most successful night fighter pilots, flying Bf-110s and subsequently J-88s, ultimately achieving 66 confirmed kills by the war's end. In post-war conversations, Streib was asked about the Me-210. He tersely replied that it was a failed aircraft that should never have been produced and preferred not to discuss it further. When pressed, he explained that the Me-210 harmed German pilot morale more than any Allied aircraft because it symbolized their own side's incompetence rather than enemy superiority. Streib died in 2001. His personal papers, donated to a German aviation museum, included a detailed 1942 diary with entries about flying the Me-210. He wrote that the aircraft made him doubt whether Luftwaffe leadership truly cared about pilot survival. If they could approve an aircraft as dangerous as the Me-210 for production,
What other defective equipment might they force pilots to use?
Strib noted that this erosion of trust in leadership was more damaging than the aircraft itself. Italian pilots who flew the Bar 88 described it as a national disgrace. Captain Carlo Ruspoli, who led a squadron equipped with Bar 88s in North Africa, recorded in his memoirs that the aircraft embodied all that was wrong with Italian military procurement. Though it appeared modern and propaganda lauded it, it could not perform its intended missions. Ruspoli recounted the frustration of receiving orders to strike British positions while piloting planes that barely managed to take off. Italian pilots felt abandoned by their command, sent into combat with machines that guaranteed failure.
Once the Bar 88s were grounded, Ruspoli's squadron was re-equipped with German Bf 109s.
The difference was stark. The Messerschmitt fighters were older designs but fully functional. They could take off with full combat loads, maintain formation, reach engagement zones, and confront the enemy. These basic operational abilities, which should have been minimum standards, were luxuries compared to the Bar 88. Ruspoli survived the war and became a journalist, spending decades documenting Italian military history and critiquing the corruption and incompetence that produced disasters like the Bar 88.
He died in 1987.
The aircraft that was meant to showcase Italian engineering instead exposed the industry's inability to produce competitive combat aircraft, contributing to Italy's declining military effectiveness and reinforcing the perception that it was the weakest Axis power.
The historical significance of these failed aircraft is complex.
They are often excluded from popular World War II histories that emphasize successful designs like the Spitfire, Mustang, Zero, and Messerschmitt Bf 109.
Failures are less celebrated, less documented, and less remembered. Yet, understanding these shortcomings is crucial to comprehending how air combat evolved during the war.
The Buffaloes defeated Midway forced the U.S. Navy to accelerate the deployment of superior fighters such as the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. Had the Buffalo been merely adequate, pressure to develop better replacements might have been weaker. The Me-210 debacle compelled Messerschmitt to completely redesign its heavy fighter strategy, culminating in the Me-410, which, while not flawless, was significantly improved. The Bar 88's failure pushed Italy to adopt German aircraft for its air force, tacitly acknowledging its industry could not produce competitive designs. These aircraft also serve as cautionary lessons for modern military procurement. The mistakes that produced the Buffalo, Me-210, and Bar 88 persist in contemporary defense programs. Modern weapons systems that suffer cost overruns, performance deficits, and operational problems often mirror patterns established by these World War II failures. The F-35 Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter, developed for the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, encountered numerous challenges during development, including weight issues, software delays, and performance compromises from attempting to meet multiple service requirements. The program continued despite these difficulties because too much political and financial capital had been invested, echoing the Buffalo scenario in which known deficiencies were tolerated due to lack of immediate alternatives.
The lesson is clear but hard to implement. Pressure to deploy new equipment rapidly, combined with bureaucratic and political momentum, can override sound engineering judgment.
The cost is not borne by officials making the decisions but by soldiers, sailors, and pilots forced to operate inadequate equipment in combat. At Midway, Major Floyd Parks and 13 other Marine pilots paid that cost with their lives.
Parks, 34, left behind a wife and 2 young children. His death was not heroic in the traditional sense. He was neither outnumbered nor outmaneuvered by a superior enemy.
He was flying an aircraft that could not compete.
When he attempted proper defensive maneuvers, his Buffalo failed to respond quickly enough, breaking apart under stress.
Parks fell into the Pacific and drowned. His body was never recovered. His widow received a telegram stating he was missing in action.
3 months later, he was declared killed in action.
His name is commemorated on the tablets of the missing at the Honolulu Memorial in Hawaii, alongside thousands of other service members lost in the Pacific. The memorial does not indicate he died piloting an inadequate aircraft. The official record merely notes he was killed in action against Japanese forces. This is technically accurate but incomplete. He perished because his government sent him into combat with inferior equipment. The 14 pilots lost at Midway included both seasoned squadron leaders and fresh flight school graduates. Some died instantly when their aircraft exploded, others bailed out but drowned before rescue arrived. Many remains were never recovered, and families received telegrams declaring their loved ones missing in action.
Months later, the status changed to killed in action, without closure, only names engraved on memorial stones. Second Lieutenant William Brooks survived being shot down in his Buffalo.
His aircraft was severely damaged by Zero fire during the engagement, the landing gear failed to retract, and the engine lost power. Brooks attempted to return to Midway but had to ditch 4 miles from the island. He escaped the sinking Buffalo, inflated his life vest, and spent 3 hours in the water before a PBY Catalina rescued him. Brooks suffered hypothermia and shock but recovered, returning to duty 6 weeks later, flying Wildcats for the remainder of the war. In post-war interviews, Brooks described experiencing survivor guilt, believing he lived while more capable pilots perished, attributing his survival to luck regarding where the Zeros concentrated their attacks. Dozens of German pilots died in training accidents while flying the Mi-210, incidents that should never have occurred. Landing gear collapses killed pilots on touchdown, aircraft skidded off runways and caught fire, crews were trapped in cockpits and perished before rescuers could intervene. Investigations consistently cited structural weakness in the landing gear, a known problem with the Mi-210.
Veteran pilots could not prevent deaths caused by inadequate equipment.
Their deaths were categorized as training accidents rather than combat losses, so they do not appear in Luftwaffe casualty statistics but are interred in military cemeteries across Germany.
Gravestones note they died in service but not the circumstances.
Italian pilots in North Africa flew Bar 88 missions in planes that could barely lift off, risking life in machines more dangerous than the enemy.
Multiple pilots perished attempting takeoffs with full bomb loads.
Aircraft would accelerate down runways, achieve liftoff momentarily, then sink back due to insufficient airspeed. Landing gear would collapse, planes would slide into sand and overturn, crushing pilots under collapsed canopies. Official records cited accidents during takeoff, but the real cause was that the Bar 88 could not handle full combat loads in North African heat. Every pilot and squadron commander knew this, yet orders mandated missions. Pilots died because their aircraft failed them. These men deserve recognition not as failures, but as victims of systemic failures beyond their control. They demonstrated valor by flying aircraft they knew were inadequate, executing missions despite unfavorable odds.
Second Lieutenant Charles Cohen climbed into his Buffalo on June 4, 1942. Aware of its reputation as a flying coffin, knowing the fate of Buffalo aircraft in Asia, and understanding he might not survive the hour.
He flew regardless, demonstrating courage beyond the aircraft's capacity. When his Buffalo was shot down and ditched, he survived through skill and luck, keeping the damaged aircraft level long enough to gain speed for a controlled water landing despite shattered instruments and a seized engine. He swam to safety and was rescued. His survival was due not to the Buffalo but to his skill and determination in the face of failure. The Brewster Buffalo, Messerschmitt Mi-210, and Breda Bar 88 represent some of the worst fighter aircraft of World War II, not for being slow or lightly armed, but for failing to fulfill their intended roles. They could not compete with enemy planes, endangered their pilots, wasted resources, and embodied institutional failures that cost lives and morale. In military aviation history, these aircraft serve as cautionary examples of how not to design combat aircraft. Lessons learned came at great cost, paid by pilots who deserved better. The men who flew these inadequate planes showed courage surpassing their machine's capabilities, fighting with deficient tools and dying when those tools failed. Their sacrifice must be remembered, as it underscores how equipment quality directly impacts survival and how distant institutional decisions carry life or death consequences for those executing them.
Major Floyd Parks, Second Lieutenant Charles Cohen, Oberleutnant Vera Streib, and countless others deserve recognition not for the aircraft they flew, but for their resolve to fly them despite knowing the risks.
These planes were deplorable, the pilots who flew them were extraordinary.